Okay, folks, we're going to start by learning about arguments, which is a piece of stuff that we'll learn in concordance with a subroutine. So an argument is related to subroutines, which is our bigger topic now. We're going to get a little deeper. And we're going to do that by first completing this objective. By the end of this, you should be able to write custom subroutines with the option to pass them arguments, and we're going to learn about what that is. It's a way of sort of passing information to the code inside. To do that, we're going to start by reviewing what we talked about with custom subroutines, and then we're going to get deep into the arguments. I'll give you a couple examples. So let's start by reviewing what a subroutine is and what we've been doing with that. So remember, we can write private sub and then give our subroutine a name. This one's called my subroutine, and then those little parentheses. And then in the end, we have this end sub. And now we've created a custom subroutine that is just a little chunk of code that will execute. We can put any code we want on the inside. It's a little chunk of code that will execute whenever we come up and click my subroutine. Not click, but type out my subroutine with these parentheses. We can write that anywhere else in our code, and the code inside this subroutine will run. So for example, I can do in my button one click subroutine, so when I click something, I can run this my subroutine. So every time I click this button, then my subroutine will execute. Any of the code in here will go. So there's two pieces to a subroutine: writing your custom little piece of code between your own private sub and end sub, naming it, and then calling the subroutine is done right here in some other subroutine. You can say, hey, run my code. All right, so let's just do a quick example of how that works again so we can remember. We had this program a long time ago, right, where we had two different numbers in text boxes, and if we hit add, it would add them together. This is getting a little bit too easy for us now. And we want to make sure that that the user has put a number in both the first and second text boxes, right? So I don't know if you ever tried this, but if you don't put anything in either of these boxes, then the program encounters an error. So we want to let the user know, hey, you need to put something in there. So if they hit add, subtract, multiply, or divide, or exponentiate, if either of these are blank, then an error should pop up to the user. Now here's the problem. Without subroutines, we'd have to write the same code 5 times, once in each of these 5 different buttons. But with the subroutine, when we have repetitive pieces of code that we're using again and again, well, then we have this special subroutine to cover that problem for us. All right, so in that example, we're trying to say, hey, if their text boxes are empty, then we better pop up with an error. So we're saying, all right, we're going to do an error check. So that's the name of our subroutine. We're checking for errors. And we want to say, all right, if either of the first 2 text boxes are empty, then we need to display an error message. So you can say, all right, if text box 1 is empty, or if text box 2 is empty. So now if either of those is empty, then we're going to go inside this if statement. And in there, we'll make a little error. So we say message box, fill in both the numbers. Okay, so let's just review that one more time. Here's my subroutine. It's called error check. It's got a name. It's checking for errors. Here's my end sub. So anything inside these private sub and end sub will run whenever I call error check. And I'm saying, all right, if either the first text box or the second text box is blank, then I'm going to provide an error in a message box to the user. So here we are in my multiply button, and instead of having to write all that complicated code, all I have to say is, hey, check for errors. And I can write whatever else I want in the multiply button. And again, I can say, oh, check for errors in the subtract button. Okay, so this is really powerful stuff. A subroutine can give us the same piece of code, these first 3 lines up here, the if statement to check for errors, and we can use it all over the place, and we don't have to type out a whole bunch of code over and over and over again. All right, so what do arguments do, and what's that all about? So an argument is not a fight with Mr. Caden, okay? It is not that. An argument in the context of computer science is a little bit more interesting, and we actually can do a lot with it. An argument is a piece of data that's passed to the subroutine. So as you saw before, a subroutine is up here, right? It has this in here. Now we can look at text boxes and things like that, but we're not passing any information to the subroutine directly. What an argument does is just that. We pass information to it. So you can think of a subroutine as like a factory, right? Whenever we turn on the factory, whenever it's working, then we can have it output something like that error message or like hello world, right? And right now our factories, when we run them, we say, hey, subroutine, run. And it does a process, right? It spits out a message box or something along those lines. Okay, but we're going to do something a little, or resets the game as we had in the guess the number game. Okay, we're going to do something a little bit more interesting, which instead of just pumping out something or doing the same operation, our factory is actually going to take input and then pass out special outputs. Let me show you what I mean. Instead of just saying hello world, maybe we can say to the factory, here, let's send Mars in the front door of the factory, and instead of saying hello world, we'll say hello Mars when the subroutine is done. Or we could pass in Jupiter, and it will say hello Jupiter. Okay, so an argument is when we just pass information to the subroutine, and then we can do stuff with it. All right, so how do we use it? First of all, when we're first writing the subroutine, we have to declare the arguments just like we do it with a variable. So we say, all right, private my subroutine, I should say private sub right there, private sub my subroutine, and the end sub, just like we did before. But now, instead of these closed parentheses, we have something in here, and it's a little bit confusing what it is. So let's take our time. An argument within the subroutine is very much like a variable. So we have to declare it at the top of the subroutine. And this is a special place where we do that. We start by writing by val, and we're going to learn more about that a little bit later. But for now, it means by value. Okay, don't worry about it. Just write by val. It's like dim. What does it mean? Who cares? Okay, and then we give the argument its name. In this case, I've called it argument 1. We can give it better names later on. And then just like you dimension an argument or a variable as a string or an integer or something like that, here we're going to declare it as some kind of type. Okay, and that's really confusing. So again, you just need by val, the name of the variable, and then as some kind of type, an integer, a decimal, a string, or something. Okay, and then you can put any subroutine code you want in on the inside, just like it was before. Okay, but now what's special is the subroutine can use the argument that gets passed to it. Let me show you how that works. Because when you actually call the subroutine, instead of just saying my subroutine with 2 little parentheses like we did before, now we can pass the argument. So here in my button, when I click on it, I can pass an argument like a variable and give it to my subroutine so that in the inside of my subroutine, the argument gets used. All right, really confusing. Let's look at an example. All right, so let's say, and this will come up a little bit in the project, the next assignment that you have. Let's say we're finding the area of a triangle all the time in our program. It's some kind of geometry program, and all the time we're finding the areas of triangles. And we're tired of doing this code over and over again. We always have to just find the area and put it on a message box, and it's annoying. So we start by writing instead a function that will calculate the area of a triangle and put it in a message box. So here it is. It's called area. I've called this function area. So we say private, and this should say, sorry, private sub area. Okay, and then it says by val, like we always say. Well, of course, to calculate the area of a triangle, we need base times height divided by 2, right? So we need something called base, and that's going to be a number. It's a decimal. And then we can have a comma here and actually have multiple arguments. So we say by val height as a decimal. So now we have 2 arguments being passed to this subroutine. Okay, the base of the triangle as a decimal because it's going to be a number, and the height of the triangle, because that's also going to be a number, is declared as a decimal. And we have this comma separating 2 separate arguments. And you can actually have as many arguments as you want. Okay, and of course the area of a triangle is base times height divided by 2. So we can actually use a message box to say what the area will be. So we'll say message box 1/2 times base times the height. All right, one more time. So I just want to review and make sure we have it. We've made our own subroutine, and again, I keep forgetting to write sub here. I need to fix that. It says private sub, and then we've named our subroutine. It's called area. And now instead of just having area do the same thing every time, we're going to pass it 2 arguments, 2 pieces of information that we can use inside the subroutine. And we're going to say, all right, we're going to say by val like we always do, and I've declared one argument as base, and it's a decimal. And then again, with a comma in between by val, the height as a decimal. All right, hopefully we get all that. And then we send a message box out that's 1/2 base times height, which of course is the area of a triangle. Okay, so how do we use this later on? So somewhere else in the code, you could say, for example, area of 2, 4. Okay, we're passing the 2 values, 2 arguments into area. So area says, all right, my base is 2 because that was the first number, and my height is 4 because that was the second, and you can see the comma separates them. And we say, all right, message box 1/2 of base, which is 2, and height, which is 4. 2 times 4 is 8, so we should get 4, right? Half of 4 is 8. Oh, sorry, half of 8 is 4. Okay, so So we can use arguments in any way we want. We can throw them in there as 2 and 4. We can also use them as variables, right? So I can say my variable is my height, and this other variable is called my base is 8. So I've named 2 variables, and I've given them both values, and now I throw them into the area function, right? It says, okay, now 4 and 8 are getting thrown into the area. I'm separating them by comma. Okay, and the area subroutine will throw out message box, with 1/2 base times height. So 4 times 8 is 32, and half of that is 16. Okay, so this is a little confusing. We've got our subroutine up here. It's got arguments that are getting passed to it, 2 arguments in this case called base and height. Okay, and then it uses those arguments inside the subroutine. Okay, so if we pass it, we say, instead of just saying area like we used to, we could say area 2 comma 4, and that says, okay, my base is 2 since that's the first number, my height is 4, so I can get the area of my triangle. Okay, now you can also use variables instead of just straight up numbers in the function, and you can give values to the variables and they get passed right in there. All right, so we want to be a little bit careful, and it's not because of the arrow that I left on the screen, but it's about something a little bit different. And we want to be careful about the variable scope in these situations. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Remember how sometimes in your projects you have to make a number go up by 1, right? You say, okay, the number is equal to number plus 1, and that's pretty annoying. Or, in the hot dog program, for example, when you press plus, you took the hot dog number and added 1 to it. So in this case, let's make a subroutine, for example, to do that. We can say, all right, we're going to call it a private sub. Remember, I'm forgetting to write sub there, and say increase, because this is going to increase our thing by 1. We say, and then we pass it 1 argument. We'll call it number as a decimal, and we'll say, all right, well, number equals number plus 1. Okay, so here we have our subroutine, and all it does is it takes 1 argument and it increases it by 1. It's called number. Okay, so you would expect that if I went somewhere else, right, and I said, all right, I'm going to start by saying number is 1, and then I'm going to call this function, I'm going to pass it the number argument, right? So we said, all right, number is 1 for starters, and then I'm saying, all right, now throw that number 1 into my increase subroutine and show me what happens by saying message box number. So here's what you might think. You might think, all right, here's number 1, okay? I've set it equal to 1, and now I'm going to pass it into the subroutine. And in the subroutine, it says, okay, I've got my argument number equals number plus 1. So you would say, okay, now it's 2. And then when we send it out in the message box, we would expect to see 2. But we don't. We see 1. And here's the reason why. Okay, the scope of a variable is whether or not it's local or whether or not it's global, right? We learned about local variables which live inside one subroutine and global variables which span the entire program. Okay, now if I say number is equal to 1 and then I say increase number, you might have the instinct to think that this number from this subroutine is also in this subroutine. Okay, but it's not. When we say by val in particular, number as a decimal, this is just like saying dim number as a decimal, and we have a fake little variable. It's a local variable that only exists inside our special subroutine. Okay, so when we say number equals number plus 1, it disappears before it makes it out into some other function or subroutine over here. Okay, so this is really important. If we want to have something global, we can mess with the global variables inside of our subroutine, but then we don't have to pass them as arguments. What's the point? They're everywhere anyway. But a local variable only exists inside its own subroutine. It doesn't exist anywhere else. So we can do stuff to it here, but it won't exist anywhere else. All right, so that does it. We've had some examples on how to use argument, and hopefully you've got the picture, and you'll be able to use it in these functions when you start on the next assignment, which is assignment 3. So in this assignment, you're going to be calculating the area of several different things: a square, a rectangle, and this says square. It's going to be a triangle before I upload it. And when you click any of these buttons that say calculate the area, it will give you the area in this box that says square inches based on the lengths that they put in the boxes up here. Okay, and then where the subroutine argument is going to come in is this convert to square centimeters button. There it is right there, right? If we press that button, we should be converting this number into a square centimeters number in this box no matter what. So in each of these buttons, you'll be passing an argument from this box and converting it into this text box down there in square centimeters. And of course, the only piece of vocabulary for today is an argument. Good. This is our plan was to learn about arguments, and I think we did. So go ahead and get started.